Hello and welcome back to the Reserve Funding Analyzer. My name is Steve Beisel, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to use the RFA to develop a funding plan for your reserve items and special projects. In the last video I demonstrated the data entry, and I left it at some simple data entries which included the financial data, which you see right here. And financial data included the started reserve balance, the current annual HOA dues, and the current operational expenses, and our assumption for a inflation rate. Also, we entered data which included all of the reserve component items, and we have one item here of a potential special project that we want to try. And you may recall that I left you with this data, and I said that the next one we would do some financial data entry. We put in just some basic financials, as I just mentioned earlier, and now I'm going to go through how to adjust the annual dues and other income producing elements in order to meet our financial commitments. Now look on this graph here, the annual reserve balance versus reserve expenses. We have the only income that we're generating is our current annual HOA dues of $65,000 a year, which amounts to about $575 per unit that you can see in this graph here. Now in this graph back up here, the annual reserve balance, you see the red bars indicate the expense items that we anticipate over the next 30 years, and the gray bars indicate the annual reserve balance. And you can see that without increasing our income, we're going to soon run out of money. In fact, we'll run out of money in about 2027. So the obvious easy answer to develop income is to increase the annual dues, at least to keep pace with inflation. So we have an inflation rate of 3%. So what happens if we put 3% starting in the year 2019 and just drive it out for 30 years, and let's see what happens. Well, what happens is that we're keeping pace with inflation, but we've got this big 800-pound gorilla occurring in 2040, and I'm not going to go there and show you, but that just happens to be the replacement of the road surface. It's scraping the road and putting everything back down again and fresh. So we have to increase our income in order to meet that proposed expense. Now, there's a couple ways we can do that. About the most painless way would be to perhaps raise the annual dues make it 5% per year. And 5% per year works pretty good, with one problem. Starting in 2040, as you can see in this graph, we go overfunded. So we can back this off and see what 4% does. Well, 4% still leaves a shortfall. So at what point do we get the right balance? So it becomes a trial and error. Now, I want you to notice that we have the auto set to auto set here. And now what that means is that it'll automatically apply the increases, numbers 2 and 3, to be starting at the earliest start. It's just a tool to help you put in these values. So let's go with 5% again, but instead of 30 years, let's drive it out for 10. And then starting in 2029, let's go 4% and put it in for another 10. And let's see what that does. Oh, that doesn't do too badly at all. You can see that we have enough money in 2040 to meet that significant expense of the road overlay. And we can continue to work with this to fine-tune it. So, for example, we could drop this down to 9 years and increase this to 11 years and see what happens. And I want you to just see that there are certain things we can do to allow ourselves the ability to make those payments. So let's back this off and go back to 10 and 10, and let's have a third increase starting in 2039, and let's make it 3% to keep pace with inflation and run it out for 10 years. And we get into an overfunding situation immediately around 2044. So back this off, let's make it 2%. And then 2% are overfunding occurs in about 2046, 2047. Well, you can see how running all through this sort of thing can help you achieve your goals. Another way you can achieve your goals is through special assessments. So, for example, if we didn't want to increase the annual dues by 5% and we wanted to go with 4%, and what would that do? Well, that means that in 2040, we are still having a fairly significant shortfall. Well, what if we, in, say, 2040, had a special assessment of, say, $150,000, and that would amount to $1,327 per unit, and let's include that and see what happens. Well, we can just barely meet our financial commitment. So you can see in this graph here under the annual dues and assessments per unit that we got this big influx of cash there in 2040, but in my mind, this doesn't really do something that we would like to do. So let's go ahead and remove the special assessment, go ahead and exclude that, bring this back to 5%, and we can drop this down to 3.5% and see what happens. And again, we're kind of able to meet our goals, but not comfortably. Up this to 12 and drop this back down to 8. And, we can home in here. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that we can enter this data in the control panel. When you're putting a lot of data in at once, that's not particularly easy. For example, if I go to the annual dues here, you can see that the control panel reflects all of this information that we've already entered. But I want to demonstrate one thing for you now. Let's assume that we've got our budgeting plan pretty much honed in. I want to show you how the sensitivity is to inflation. So let's go into here and change this inflation rate to 0.032, which is 3.2%. Just that extra little bit of inflation makes a dramatic difference in the annual reserve balance and reserve expenses. Likewise, we could drop it down to 0.028, which is 2.8%, and you can see that the entire budgeting plan is very sensitive to inflation. All right, let's leave it at 3%. So we'll go back here and enter it directly, enter it as a 3%. Now, I want to show you how we can use loans. Now, loans will give us an influx of cash, but obviously when we have an influx of cash, we're going to have to pay it back. But in this example that I'm using here, which is we got a very significant expense occurring in 2040, which is in today's dollars, $225,000, and $24 it would be higher. But what if we took out a loan in, say, 2040 instead of trying to increase all of our annual dues? Well, if we took out a loan in 2040, which would be road resurface, and let's take out a $200,000 loan, a significant amount of money, of course, and with an annual interest rate of 3% and a term of loan to be 15 years starting in 2040. Well, if we took out that, now I can move this over here, I can show you what that does. It isn't a bad situation. You can see here that massive influx of cash in 2040, even though we haven't done anything with our annual dues, that we end up with an overfunding situation much earlier. Well, let's go back to our annual dues again here. In fact, I'm going to go, over here to the financial summary sheets so we can see various charts and graphs. I'm going to unlink the buttons to the worksheets so that I can just go to my annual dues and I can make changes to the annual dues here while staying on the financial summary charts to see what the overall effect is. And I'm going to reduce from 5% to a 4% increase. And I'm going to try, now we're keeping that loan in place, remember. And you can see that with a 4% increase, drive it out for, say, 17 years, and let's see what happens. You can see that we're not getting into too bad of a situation, but perhaps we can run it out here for 25. And let's go ahead and remove the data from this increase of 3. We'll just drop this back. And now we have a 3.5% still starting in 2044, but we could just remove this as well, and let's see what this is going to do for us. So we got a 4% increase, and we'll just run it for 30 years and see what will happen. So we run this for 30 years. This could be acceptable for some people. Now, you can see in the start of year reserve percent funding that we're dropping down in some cases as much as 29% in, below the actual threshold. What that does is increases our risk for special assessments. Well, if we go down here, we can watch what our risk of special assessments looks like. It's not too bad. We're running a moderate risk out in these years of 2031 to 2033. We have a high risk of 2040, but that's because of that enormous expense that we have to resurface the roads. Here in this chart of the annual income by source, you can see we have a one-time income, which includes the infusion of capital in order to pay for the roads occurring in 2040. But in this example, even with the loans, we're able to keep our HOA dues a little bit lower than otherwise would have been expected. So there's no right and wrong way to build your funding plan, but I just wanted to show you that this is one area that we could do where we could use loans and that kind of thing. There's another thing that we can do to generate or to change our funding plan, and I'm going to go to the reserve components. Let's go and see if we can get the right worksheet here. Sorry. So we get the worksheet here, and I'm going to move this over to the side a little bit. Now, here's that $225,000 expense, which is occurring in 2040. We can do a little what-if analysis here and add 1 year, which is delaying that road resurfacing from 2040 to 2041. And then I'm going to close this control panel. Now you can see what that did. And let me just repeat it for you again. Let's bring it back to the 2040 year. Let's add a year and see what that does. You can see that it slightly improves things. If we reduce it by a year, have to do it a year earlier, we're going to have to move our loan in. We're going to have to move our loan back into 2039 in order to pay for it. But again, this is just to demonstrate for you the sensitivity of the analysis where you can defer or bring forward particular reserve component expenses. We wanted to put in a security camera. What if we didn't include the security camera? How would that improve things? We'd have to just exclude those items. It makes a pretty dramatic improvement. So again, I don't want to say that there's a right and wrong way to do this. I just wanted to demonstrate some of the things that you can do. Now, all of this data is reflected in the other sheets. For example, if I go to the reserve component summary, it'll reiterate all of those items. We have the maintenance schedule, which continues to be set up so that every year you know what funding requirements are going to be required in order to meet the maintenance and or replacement of various reserve components. You have the income and expense summary here, which includes the loan expenses, which is the repayment of the loans. And you can see on this chart that we take out a loan in 2040, but we have to start repaying for it by 2041. And you can see what that amounts to in loan expenses. Our financial details table is also updated each time you make a change, but when you go to the financial detail tables, it takes a little while to refresh the worksheets, but it'll get there. So that's pretty much the analysis that you can do. Obviously, the data that you put in is going to make a significant change for you. When you get the workbook, you can actually use the sample data that's in there to massage things so that you can see how you can make changes and what effect it has. Well, that's pretty much it. I'm going to go back to the home page here by bringing up my control panel. As soon as it loads, it's taking a little time, and once it loads, I'm going to go relink the buttons and go ahead and go back to the home page. It might take twice. There we go. We're done. Anyway, if you have any questions, please shoot them my way. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching.